Hello, this is Kyle, also known as AlienTude, and today I am reviewing this Cold Steel Hand and a Half sword. Let's start with some background information about this sword. First off, I did not pay for it. It was sent to me as a gift from sword friend Brian, so thank you, Brian, for your generosity. Now, this sword sells on Cold Steel's website for around $390, but that's kind of wildly overpriced. That's their MSRP, but if you look around, you can find it much cheaper. Cold Steel Shop on Amazon, for instance, has it for $265. I put a link in the description. You can also find it a few other places. Cult of Athena has it, but they're back ordered and their list price is around $320. So at that price, I would look around more. I would recommend not buying this from Cult of Athena, even if they have it in stock at that price. For the purposes of this review, I'm going to consider this a $265 sword, since that is the official price from Cold Steel on Amazon. Cold Steel also has a man-at-arms version of this sword, which is a little bit different. It's all blacked out, and the grip is a little bit shorter, and I think it's about $200. I don't remember the exact price. You'll see it on screen here. And it looks to me like Cold Steel has updated the scabbard since this model, because at least their picture on the Amazon listing shows some decoration on the metal locket. I've reviewed a few other Cold Steel swords, so just a quick refresher about the company. They are based in America, but they don't actually make their swords. They contract out to a variety of companies, with the primary one for this general European style sword is going to be Windlass. Not all of them are by Windlass, but the majority are, and I would say 98% confident this is Windlass's work. Before getting into the nitty-gritty details about the sword, just a few things I want to point out. First off, this is a modern sword. While it takes some design cues from historical ones, there's enough here that is just ahistorical that it's not really designed based on any specific oakshot type. It's kind of a blend of a few of them, and to me that makes it basically a modern sword rather than a reproduction of a historical type. Something else to point out is that when you're talking at this price point, under $300, swords will have compromises. There's going to be corners cut somewhere in different places. The most important thing for me is that the sword handles properly, does what a sword is supposed to do, and is safe to use. It's functional. So when I'm going through this review, I'm going to be pointing out little things that are compromises to bring the price down. That doesn't mean that these are flaws. I'm just pointing them out because if the sword is worth it to you is dependent on those compromises. Are you willing to accept them for the relatively inexpensive price? It's an equation that nobody can answer for you. I can give my opinion, but it really is up to you. The scabbard the sword comes with is a wood core with leather wrap and then a metal locket and metal chape. I believe these are steel, or they're at least ferrous because they do react to a magnet. Now, the leather on here is a little cheap feeling. It feels a little kind of like vinyl, a little off, not really feeling like leather. And I think it's possible that it is not actual genuine leather, but some kind of fake leather. I'm not at all an expert on that, so I can't say for sure. What I will say though is there's a seam down the back and it's a little bit loose here, the leather. I can move it around pretty easily. And that tells me that if I were to put this scabbard to a good amount of use, the leather would probably come off pretty easily, unfortunately. The design of the chape I actually quite like. This little extra kind of cross-like design is pretty cool. I like it. It does catch a little bit if I run my finger here. It'll catch on my finger. I could see that catching on some clothes pretty easily as well. The locket, I'm not as big of a fan of, but just in general because I'm not a huge fan of lockets on scabbards. The design is fine. It's just not my cup of tea for how they look. The locket does wrap around the mouth of the scabbard, but there is still some leeway between the edge of the locket and the wood, so when you draw and sheath the sword, it's not going to interact with the metal here and dull the sword. That's a good thing. Just looking in the mouth here, this wood looks pretty low quality to match the leather. These lower quality materials, not unexpected at this price point. You know, a scabbard, in my opinion, at this price point is pretty much a bonus anyways, so I can't complain about lower quality materials. The fit of the sword to the scabbard is actually quite good. There is no rattle at all. If I come down here and shake it just down here, I can get a tiny bit of rattle, but not much at all. If I hold it upside down, it stays in place. If I shake it gently, it stays in place. I have to really, really shake it to get it to come out at all. So that's a really good fit, especially because it takes no effort to draw at all. And drying it and sheathing it, it's actually a very smooth and easy draw and sheath. It feels really nice drawing and sheathing it. So overall, the scabbard, while I think the materials are rather lackluster, it's better than I would expect at this price point. Taking a look at the hilt, the crossguard is a very simple design. It's nearly a flat bar, but it does start thicker here and where it meets the grip in the blade, and then tapers in thickness a little bit out towards the tips of the quillins and rounds out a little bit out here as well. All of the corners here are crisp, but not particularly sharp. That said, I wouldn't want to wrap my finger around the guard because, for two reasons. The blade is actually still pretty sharp there, and also the crossguard is just a little bit chunky, and it feels a little bit too big to really comfortably wrap my finger around it. The cross section of the guard is pretty much rectangular. This is one of those compromises I talked about earlier, where when you've got a budget sword like this, you can't have as much detail and refinement as perhaps medieval swords actually had, because you have to cut costs somewhere. And one of the ways they did on this sword is with a very, very simple crossguard. The finish on the guard is kind of what I would consider a shiny satin or a dull mirror. It's kind of right between satin and mirror, where it's more reflective than a satin finish, but not as reflective as a true mirror. There are some scuffs and scratches and discolorations here and there, but that's to be expected. And if we look at the gap in the crossguard where it meets the blade, this is actually better than I would expect at this price point. Sure, there is room for improvement here, but there doesn't need to be improvement at this price point. It's a relatively small gap and pretty well done. The pommel here is a scent stopper style with a little bit of decoration added with these grooves cut in. Normally you wouldn't see these grooves, you would just have solid metal here. It's just something they did to add to the look of the sword, I assume. And overall, I think it actually works very well. It's a well executed scent stopper, and all of the edges are crisp, but they aren't sharp at all. They're all smoothed over nicely, and that's especially true at this ridge line here. Some scent stoppers there, when your hand is gripping it, it'll bump against those oftentimes, and they can sometimes be pretty sharp and uncomfortable. Here, it's not the case at all. These have been smoothed over very nicely, and to make up for a very functional pommel that really does help extend the grip. I can grip it down there very easily without any issues at all. The finish is pretty much just like the crossguard, that kind of shiny satin rough mirror. The pommel is attached with a nut assembly. I don't know the exact type of nut because it's been rounded over and smoothed over here. It's not one that you could insert like an Allen wrench into and disassemble. Since it's cylindrical, you would need to probably get a little creative with some vice clamps or something like that and very gently unscrew it. I can say though that in the time I've used it, it hasn't felt loose at all. There hasn't been any looseness in the hilt anywhere. So the nut assembly is certainly working. The good thing about that, having that nut assembly, is that this grip, this hilt can be disassembled. And I say that's a good thing because of the next section when I start talking about the grip. So right up front, the grip is the worst part of this sword, in my opinion. It is wood core with the leather wrap. It feels like the same leather or fake leather as on the scabbard, and it just doesn't feel great. It feels a little bit too slick, a little soft, but not in a good way. It just feels like very low grade material. If it is leather, it's pretty much the cheapest they could find, I would think. The shaping here, I talk about this more in the handling section, so I'm not going to go into detail here, but the shaping here leaves a little bit to desired. It's not a bad shape to the grip, but it's not my preference. Now, these risers that they have here are really weird. Normally when you see a riser on a grip that from a European style sword, it's going to be smaller than this, for one thing. These things are very wide, but also they are usually formed by adding something underneath the leather on top of the wood core. Usually you'll take a small piece of leather and wrap it around there, and that forms the riser. Not always. You can certainly create the risers from the grip material. It's just not as normal as using a small piece of leather or something like that. And all that to be said, that's how they formed these on here, is they are lathed into the wood core. And I don't like them. They are big and clunky looking, and they don't really do anything to aid me in gripping the sword, which I tend to find risers help me index the sword and know where my hands are and just really help lock the sword into the hand. And I don't find these do that. And on top of that, I think they look ugly. So that's not to say this is a bad grip. It's not. It's functional. It works. I don't have much problem indexing the blade, anything like that. It's just not quite my preference, and I think it could be improved. One thing that is really good, though, is the transitions from the grip to the crossguard and the pommel, especially the pommel here. Scent stoppers have a lot of facets to them, and it's very easy for those facets to overhang the leather and create a hot spot. Here, the leather is overlapping the pommel in every single facet, and it has absolutely no hot spots. So that's a really good attention to detail that they put in and executed very well. Now, since the hilt is able to be disassembled if you have the right tools, one of the biggest improvements you could make to this sword would be to strip off the leather, sand down the risers, and just put a more traditional European style grip on it with, the cord texture and a much higher quality leather. And I think it would vastly improve this sword's feel, look, and performance. And now it's time to talk about the business end, the blade. As always, here's my measurements. So the blade is 33.5 inches long. It starts at about 6.5 millimeters thick with noticeable but relatively light distal taper, ending a little bit thick at 4.5 millimeters, 2 inches from the tip. It weighs in at 3 pounds 6 ounces and is balanced at just under 4 inches. The blade percussion node is at about 20.5 inches, maybe a little closer to the guard than I would normally expect, but not problematically so. Now, when you're looking at the finish on this sword in the close-ups, you're going to see some flaws. There's some black specks here and there, grind marks, that kind of thing, a lot of scuffs. Not a problem, in my opinion, especially at this price point. It's also notable that this sword came to me with a lot of Ren wax on it. It had a very thick layer on it. I've removed a good amount of it, but there is still some on there, and I'm debating whether or not I want to completely strip it off entirely. But the amount that's on there still does affect the look of the sword a little bit. It's got a little bit of a slightly duller look from that Ren wax. The overall symmetry of the sword is actually really well done. From the crossguard all the way out to the point, it's got very minor asymmetries in the tip, but you really will only notice them with extreme close-ups if you're really looking for them. I don't think I was even able to get them on camera. So that's well done. In addition, there's a really minor amount of rippling when I look down the blade. Much better than I typically expect to see from windlass. They typically have a good amount of rippling in them, and their central ridges are usually waver around a little bit. And this one, it's very crisp and very straight, like I said, with very little rippling, which is impressive work for windlass and a good job done on this sword. And I kind of wonder if, because this is a thicker blade at 6.5 millimeters than what Windlass typically makes, that most of their swords are around 4.5 to 5 millimeters at the guard. I wonder if that extra thickness, that different stock that they're using, changes their process for making this and reduces the amount of rippling in it. In any case, it's far less rippling than you would normally see at any sword in this price range. I mentioned earlier in the review that this sword is not really based on any historical type. The profile of it is kind of like a Type 12A in that it starts relatively broad and has gentle and even profile taper before getting into an acute point that is kind of rounded but not fully. However, a Type 12A sword would typically have a fuller, the majority of the length of the sword, and then also would have either a very flat hexagonal or a lenticular cross section, whereas this has a flat diamond throughout. So that's what I was talking about when this is not really representative of any Oakshott type. There is no sword from the Oakshott typology that follows this general look. Honestly, it reminds me a lot more of Chinese Jian, which sometimes you will see broad with a diamond throughout. I don't know how this compares to those swords though. So let's test the edge on some paper. My expectations here are for a sword to be able to cut into the paper from the edge with a simple draw motion. If it fails to bite into the edge, I will then insert the sword and draw it through to see if it can slice the paper once the cut has already started. If it fails to do even that, I consider the sword to be not sharp enough. Biting into the edge is the primary goal, in my opinion, though, and it's what I think a sword should be able to do. So it did fail to bite in there. Now I do like to do this a few times because sometimes the angle isn't quite right, and it's just a good idea to give it a few attempts. Failed there. Okay, so it cut a little bit there, and then it started tearing. Let me get a new piece of paper. All right, let's try again. Completely failed there. So I kind of rocked it back and forth a little bit to get the cut started there, and then it cut through, and it's cutting relatively cleanly, but it's not as smooth and as graceful as a slice as I would like. Now that one went very, very well. I'm going to test the other edge now. So there it cut very, very nicely as well. It was still a little bit more jagged than a perfectly clean slice, but it was good enough. What is going on here, why it's failing to bite in sometimes but not others, is that this is a very toothy edge. So sometimes when I'm starting the cut, it doesn't catch and bite in every single time because the edge is a little uneven, very toothy. Once it starts the cut though, it goes pretty cleanly and easily. And when I say toothy, I really do mean it. I can look close up and see the jaggedness in the edge. And it's something I wasn't really able to capture on camera. It just flat out refused to focus that closely on the edge, so you'll kind of have to take my word for it. The edge beveling here, however, is excellent. It's one smooth bevel from the center ridge all the way to the edge with no secondary bevel and no micro bevel. That jaggedness in the edge tells me that they likely brought the sword to fully sharp. It is apexed properly and sharp, but they did not then polish the edge and refine it at a higher grit of sandpaper or whatever tool they would use to polish it. This is sharper than most swords on the market, especially in this price range. It could be improved by polishing the edge, but again, this is one of those compromises you make for a lower cost sword. Let's talk about cutting. I did both water bottles and pool noodles. I'll get to water bottles in a minute. With pool noodles, I wasn't really able to get it to cut them. It would cut about a 1/2 inch to 1 inch into the noodle and then it would bash it aside. I think there's two things going on there that really contribute to this. First off, the edge is that kind of jagged, toothy edge. It's cutting into, but it's doing more of a tear rather than slicing the noodle. And I think that's causing the issue. In my experience with pool noodles, to get good clean cuts, you really want a very polished, very nicely apexed blade. And this has the apexing, but it doesn't have the extra polishing on it. And I think it's tearing rather than cutting. The other thing is that this is a relatively thick sword at the sweet spot. And because it has that thickness and it's not really cutting cleanly, more of the energy is being transferred to the noodle from the center ridge and that part of it than the actual cutting edge. So as that energy is being transferred into it, it's pushing it aside rather than delivering the clean cut. If the edge got polished up on this, I think it would probably be a pretty dang effective pool noodle cutter. As for water bottles, it cuts them okay. It's not great, but it's not terrible. I found that I didn't really have any cuts where I just bashed the bottle around. It pretty consistently cut into the bottles and most of the time cut all the way through. Although if you look at the exit wounds of the bottles, if you will, they oftentimes had some jagged tearing and kind of exploded in a few parts. And that's just kind of what you get when you have a little bit more of a less refined edge. That's not to say it's bad. This is better than a lot of swords at Backyard Cutting. In fact, I'm working on a review of another one that was miserable to cut water bottles with. And this Cold Steel was a joy compared to that one. And I think this edge would work better if it were a thinner blade, because then there would be, again, just like with the pool noodle, that extra energy from the rather, I won't say obtuse angle, but the fact that it is still relatively thick at the sweet spot means that there's more energy being transferred to the non-cutting portion of the blade, which reduces the effectiveness of the cuts. Like I said, if it were a thinner blade, it would have less chance of transferring that energy. It would be more focused on the edge. Alternatively, if this were sharpened up a bit more, if the edge were polished and refined more, it would be cutting cleaner and would just glide right through. Just my thoughts on how this works. Now, in terms of cutting and redirecting motion, I was able to do some double cuts on a milk jug very easily. It did when I did the first cut, it passed through very cleanly and did the second cut very nicely. It redirected the motion very well. I actually really enjoyed using this for those double cuts. So overall, in its default state, it's a decent backyard cutter. It's not great, but it wouldn't require much to refine the edge and get it into a really good shape and be what I think would be a very effective cutter. And honestly, that's not a problem for a lot of people. A lot of sword owners prefer to be the ones to determine the final edge and bring it to the level they want. So if that's you, that's great. Handling this Cold Steel hand-and-a-half sword is a little bit weird. It's not clunky like Cold Steel's reputation is, but it's not particularly graceful either. With the kind of odd geometry here and not a lot of distal taper, it definitely has some point weight to it, some blade presence, a little bit more weight out here than I am used to seeing on the majority of swords I review. But it still has a good feel to it overall. It's balanced pretty damn well it was around 3.5 inches, right around there. And that's a good place to be balanced at for a balanced cut and thrust sword. Although this tip geometry, while it is certainly capable of thrusting, that's certainly not its primary purpose. On the other hand, it's also a pretty stiff blade, so that does aid in the ability to thrust. So when I move the sword out there, and I just kind of try to flick the tip out, I definitely feel the weight of the tip pulling me a little bit. Not a crazy amount, and I can redirect cuts pretty well, although I wasn't doing very well there because I have a microphone right here, and I was almost hitting it there. I don't want to chop into my microphone, but I can definitely redirect motion pretty well. It's an interesting handling sword because it's not clunky, but it's not quite as graceful as, I'm repeating myself here. The majority of the swords I handle a lot are things like Albion's and Valiant Armory and Angus Trim. Those are the swords I gravitate to the most. So I'm used to their kind of handling, and this isn't that. But this is also a fraction of the price, so you have to forgive it some for that. And it's not like this is bad handling. It's not. It's not a bad sword to move around. It's just a little bit less refined of handling than you might see in swords that are 5-6 times the price. What I will say in terms of handling that I do blame a little bit is that this grip. I don't like the grip. I find it a little bit too wide right here, a little too narrow, and the seam on here creates a bit of a peak that does bite. It doesn't bite into the hand. It's comfortable in terms of discomfort, but it doesn't feel particularly good there, and it's not quite as refined as it could be. And that's not even talking about these very weird risers. Just the overall shape, it could use to be either a little bit thinner in this dimension or just a little bit thicker in this dimension, just to make it a little bit more comfortable to move around. Because no matter which way I hold it, I feel that seam and that little bit of peak in the leather. That would mean it'd be pretty simple to get this rewrapped and put a different leather grip on it, which would certainly improve it. I think the wood core could be refined a little bit more as well. Something else I want to point out on this sword that causes me a little bit of difficulty is the size of the crossguard to the blade. A lot of techniques use thumbing the blade like this, and especially false edge cuts, but some true edge cuts do it as well. And I find that this is a little bit chunky to comfortably rest my thumb on the blade. I have to really choke up a little bit, and my finger actually rests above the guard. Whereas if this were just a little bit more narrow here, I could thumb the blade a little bit better. It's not a big deal, but it's something I noticed when cutting with it. When I went to thumb the blade, I was just like, oh, I need to choke up a little bit. This feels a little bit awkward. It's not a big deal, but it is something I noticed. Now, the first comparison I have for you is this windlass Sword of Rovin. First thing I need to mention about this, it is completely blunt. So that will very slightly affect the handling of it. If it were sharp, there would be very slightly less metal in a variety of places. It's probably not enough to notice it, but I figured I'd mention it anyways. So this sword has a noticeably shorter grip, but because the pommel is long, I can still get two hands on it quite comfortably. When I'm moving this out there, this has a little bit less tip weight, which actually surprises me a little bit because it's, generally speaking, your kind of typical windlass, which is not going to feature a lot of distal taper. I think what's going on there is we have a ricasso right here that's pretty meaty, and that's bringing the weight of the sword back a little bit and keeping it from feeling like it's all the way out here. So this is also a relatively stiff blade and has a bit more flex to it. When I move it around, it has quite a bit the same feel, a little bit less tip weight, doesn't actually redirect motion quite as well, which actually surprises me a little bit. I think partially that's actually, thinking about it now, that's the grip length. With the Cold Steel one, I had a little bit more extra leverage when I'm doing the movements, so it makes it easier to change the movement. Let me pick up the Cold Steel. And just to really reiterate that, look at how much longer the Cold Steel's grip is. So yeah, when I pick this up and move it, I can really, because I have a longer grip and I have my hands separated, I can use that lever to really change the motion easier and redirect motion. And it also gives me, if I do a push-pull, it gives out this a little bit extra oomph in the cut. Not a ton more. These swords actually feel pretty similar, but small differences are kind of what you expect to get with swords of relatively similar size and shape. And my next comparison is to this Hanwei Tinker longsword. Now this one is somewhat customized. It has a separate pommel, and it's actually got like a 3D printed grip on it. I have the original grip and pommel, and I've put them on and compared the two. It barely affects the handling at all. So this is the way I got it, and I just put it back to this. It shouldn't really affect how it handles in comparison to the cold steel much at all. So when I pick this up, this is immediately a lighter sword. It's not by a lot, but it's by about 3 to 4 ounces. This weighs just under 3 pounds. The cold steel weighs around 3 pounds, 3 ounces. Those 3 ounces or so definitely are noticeable. And this sword has a much more graceful feeling to the handling. It handles a lot more like what I'm used to from swords like Albion's and the like. If I look at the point of balance, it's actually about the same as the cold steel, maybe a little bit further out, which is really interesting because it feels more correct, if you will, than the cold steel, which is further back. And usually when a sword has a further back point of balance, it feels more lively and easier to use. This one, to me, feels livelier and easier to use, but it's actually balanced a little further out. And if I'm moving it out there, there's definitely blade presence, but there's not a lot of tip weight. It definitely feels natural to move it around. I can redirect motion very easily. It's definitely a little bit more flexible than the cold steel, but not by a lot. It's got a good center of percussion right there. And I can move this out there one-handed if I really want to. This really does feel a lot more natural two-handed. Let me pick up the cold steel. So pick this up, yeah. Immediately I feel more weight out here. But also, interestingly, this feels more natural one-handed than the Hanwei Tinker does. Now this does feel better two-handed than one-handed. But it's interesting how the Hanwei Tinker feels better in two hands, but worse in one hand. If we compare them side by side, hopefully that's in the shot, looks to me like the Hanwei Tinker is a little bit longer of a blade. The grip lengths are about the same, except that the cold steel's pommel is definitely more grippable than the Hanwei Tinker. Not that that pommel is ungrippable, it's actually very comfortable. It's just that this style is very much designed to be able to grip it. So overall, this is such an interesting sword to handle. It's a fine handling sword without being a good handling sword. It has some blade authority to it, so it's going to aid you in cutting with some authority in the cut. And it's pretty stiff, which is going to aid you both in thrusting and if your edge alignment is a little off. Generally speaking, a more rigid sword will aid in powering through the cut rather than bashing the bottle or the target aside. So I've seen some people describe this as a superb sword for learning to cut with, and I can kind of see that. It has enough going for it that it is a budget option that is decent. I would never call this a great handling sword, but it's decent. It's not bad. It's okay, and it's better than others I've held. For potential improvements on this sword, this is a bit of a weird situation because we're going back to compromises. To get this sword at this price, there are compromises that have to be made. And if I'm pointing out things that could be improved, addressing them would increase the cost of the sword. It would get rid of those compromises. So that would kind of defeat the point of a sword in this price point, which is, in my opinion, to get something functional at a good price that is effective. So I'm going to point out a few things here, but that doesn't mean I think they need to be addressed. I understand and acknowledge that addressing these would likely increase the cost of the sword. But in any case, I like to point out the things that bugged me the most about the sword, and right up front, the grip is the most obvious thing. I don't like this grip. I don't like the look. I don't like the feel. I think the shaping, while it's functionally okay, it's just not comfortable in my hand, and the leather feels awful, in my opinion. A better quality leather, I don't know how much extra that would cost, but I don't think it would cost that much more, and I would really like to see it. Something else that could be improved would be the edge. You know, it could be refined more and polished up more, but that is extra cost, so I don't know. Lastly, the design of the sword, I think it could use some refinement. I think it could use another millimeter of distal taper, and it would make it a better cutter. However, that would be removing mass up here, which would pretty much affect the handling of the entire sword, would probably require less beefy pommel and crossguard, and it would just be, at that point, a complete redesign of this sword. So while I think that would be a good thing for this sword, it's, again, not really something I can really honestly say should be improved, because it basically makes it a whole new model. All right, bottom line, this sword costs roughly $265. What do you get for that price? The best way I can put it is you get a competent sword. You get a decent sword. It's not a great sword, but it's not a bad sword. You know, you get something that is fully functional and is actually sharp. It's not a particularly refined edge, but it is sharper than most swords in this price range that are sold as sharp. And that there's something to be said for that. It handles decently, it cuts decently, everything about it is okay, it's competent, and at this price point, that's really about the best you can expect to get. I don't think you can expect to get something that's outstanding for $265. There's always going to be compromises made, and there are definitely compromises here. The grip is, in my opinion, terrible. The edge it could be refined. The entire design could be refined. The leather quality is not good at all, in my opinion. The crossguard is just a little bit chunky. You know, these are a lot of minor things that could be improved, but not really for the price point. So it's a competent, decent sword, and I think that there's value in that. That is something that, you know, not everybody can afford to drop $800, $900, $1,000 plus on a sword and get something from Albion or the like. And that's okay. I think there should be swords in the market for people who are very conscious of their budget. You know, just because I can afford nicer swords does not mean that I think that they're the only thing out there. This is a fully functional sword at a price point that you just don't find very many effective, competent swords of this type. So while I do think it's worth the price, I absolutely do think it's worth the price. It's not a great sword. It's certainly not my favorite sword, but it's all right. And that's all right. It's all right for the sword to just be all right, if you know what I mean. It's a good entry at a affordable price. And if that's what you're looking for, yeah, I think this is worth the price. And that's going to wrap up this review. I want to send a special thank you to sword friend Brian for sending me this sword and allowing me to keep it. Thank you, Brian. Very generous of you, and I greatly appreciate it. For everybody else, make sure you hit the like button, leave a comment, subscribe if you haven't already. Do all the things that YouTube wants you to do to show that this channel deserves to continue to grow. Until next time, Alien 2 out.